Welcome back to the Gamer's Garden, and in this video we're looking at a largely forgotten Game Boy game about probably the most famous spy of all time. The top-down adventure game was a favourite of mine growing up, and Nintendo's Game Boy was the perfect fit, giving you pocket-sized worlds you could take with you anywhere. My home consoles were the Mega Drive and then the PlayStation, so I was always curious about what was coming out on the other Nintendo home consoles. I read about games like Lilac Wars, the Zeldas, Wave Race 64 and Turok with extreme curiosity. The Game Boy ports of these games let me peer into that other world I was missing out on. I could keep up with the latest games for Nintendo by playing the Game Boy's Link's Awakening, Wave Race, Turok 2 and James Bond 007, a game that I consider to be the very epitome of a cult classic. Of course, the games I just mentioned ported from the N64 were hugely different. How could they be that similar, given that by that console's European launch in '97, the Game Boy had 8 years on the clock. That same year, Rare released Goldeneye 007 for the N64, a truly defining moment in the evolution of video games, and no matter what great games you were playing on a different console, it was difficult not to be jealous. Now, before the international sensation that was Pokemon arrived, big franchises and ports were the driving force behind the Game Boy's continuing popularity. And given the huge success of GoldenEye 007, a Bond title for the Game Boy could fairly be expected. We got James Bond 007 by Sapphire Corporation in early '98, one of the last few games quietly released for the original Game Boy. Seeing as Game Boy adaptations had to deviate more from their source material as 3D gaming took hold, Sapphire made James Bond 007 a top-down adventure, and it still stands out to me as a fantastic example of how to tailor a game to the limitations of a handheld while still riding the popularity of a home console release. Gameplay is like a Zelda-style top-down adventure that's in stages rather than an open world. The game features a simple story that includes characters from multiple Bond films, such as Oddjob and Jaws, along with new antagonists just for this adventure. It's a real globetrotter that feels closer to the Bond universe than many other games based on the films. Combat is certainly a weaker aspect, although hand-to-hand fighting feels better, but you do get a decent range of guns later into the game as the action intensifies. In many of the earlier stages, more of your time is spent doing things more in keeping with the Bond character, like smooth-talking your way through encounters, searching for informants and double agents, gambling and using gadgets straight from Q-Branch. The first stage in Shanghai eases you in with some very linear progression and plenty of fighting, just like the pre-credit scene of any Bond film. But from the second stage onward, the more open design becomes evident. The second half of the game features more of these maze-like stages, but they never frustrated me too much, and it all builds to a satisfying finale in a proper Bond villain lair. It's actually this sense of authenticity that lifts the game where it could otherwise feel flat. The overall production value feels a bit cheap, especially when compared to Link's Awakening that released nearly 5 years earlier. The graphics are simpler than you could expect, but the Bond-themed compositions are fantastic. All the audio motifs you would expect are there. Bond walks with a trademark swagger, one hand in his pocket, and generally the sprites are charming and full of character. Each stage has a distinctly different feel, and the globe-trotting story and wacky villains evoke a sense of early Bond films from the 60s. James Bond 007 feels like an older game, and it has aged with some difficulty. These kinds of action-adventure games are so much more layered now, and the single objective at a time gameplay here makes it feel a bit archaic. What stands the test of time for me is this game's charm and wry humour. James Bond 007 effectively builds a Bond game that walks a line between the character-based sharpness of Connery and the action hero wit of Brosnan. Many games since GoldenEye 007 have tried to capture the atmosphere of James Bond, but strangely enough, this peculiar Game Boy game really is one of the most effective. Sapphire Corporation wouldn't make another game in the Bond universe, but they would develop 2 Oddworld games on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color that are definitely worth checking out. James Bond 007 hasn't received a port or virtual console release, so it's another game that, aside from emulation, you need actual hardware to play. The top-down adventure would splinter into different genres as games grew into 3D, and this leaves James Bond 007 feeling like a time capsule in comparison to a modern game, but it was perfect for the Game Boy, where a simple action game would have paled in comparison to GoldenEye 007 on the 64, James Bond 007 stood on its own, and in looking toward the older, slower-paced Bond films as inspiration, it's one of very few licensed games that effectively captures the distinct atmosphere of its source material. Thank you for watching another one of my cult classics, and I'd love to know what you think of this game in the comments. I'm trying to keep to a more consistent schedule now, so please let me know what you think of my channel, anything you think I could improve next time, and most of all, happy gaming.